Hi there, and welcome back to The Foundation Presents. I'm your host, Mike Schramm, a board member of the Foundation for West Hartford Public Schools, here to speak with two educators today about their grants. And now I'd like to welcome on Lynette Kaschke, Assistive Technology Specialist for the District of West Hartford Public Schools. Now, Lynette, can you tell me a bit about your grant?
Okay, so the grant that we were awarded back in 2018, which was the last grant that I was able to get, is for Unique Learning System. And what Unique Learning System is, it's a standards-based curriculum for students with special needs and diverse learners.
Okay, can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So basically it's broken down into 6 strands: preschool, elementary, middle school, intermediate, high school, and transition. And it focuses on different topics that are correlated with some of the topics that are in those grades to help students be able to access some of the general ed curriculum in a way that is differentiated to meet their needs.
And what would those needs be?
So some students are at picture level, so some of the texts are more basic, where they're more like sight words, and so it's more picture based and there's less detail. And there are 3 different levels of differentiation. So the first level would have the least amount of words and the most pictures, and then the second one would build on that and have more details, and then the third story would have the most details. Each one of these units have a comprehensive lesson plan with assessments built in for teachers to use. There are activities, there are other resources that are available, there are guidelines that they can take home and discuss with their parents. So it's a whole comprehensive package that basically helps the teacher to be able to work with the students at their level.
And you say that it's able to apply to different individuals with different learning needs, is that right?
Exactly. So like I said, it's differentiated. So basically if you have a student who is at the emerging language level and they don't read at their level, they read at a lower Lexile level, they're able to access the first story, if you will. There are different stories in their PowerPoint format, and so they're able to access those stories to be able to gain information. And then the next one would be a little bit more detailed, and then the third one would be the most detailed. And so it will help students who are at different levels to be able to access the same material.
Well, I have to imagine that that is a huge time saver for the teachers who are responsible for curating this more individualized curriculum.
Absolutely.
Can you tell me about the history of the program? I understand that the Foundation didn't bring this program into existence. So what existed before the grant in 2018, and then what did the grant allow you to do or change or that sort of thing? Okay,
so we have been using the Unique Learning since I've been managing it since 2013-14. And at that time, not a lot of teachers knew that we had access to it. As you can tell, it's a very limited program where, students with special needs and diverse learners, they're in specific classrooms. And so as time progressed and the students are now more in inclusive settings, more teachers were saying, well, what can we do to support these students in our classroom to help them to be engaged in some of the lessons? So we were able to have a workshop back in 2015, and we focused on the Unique Learning System to give teachers more exposure to it, to know that they have access to it and what it can do to help support those students. And as time progressed, more and more people are interested in it. So as the interest was growing, we validated the use of the program more, and unfortunately the program price increased and each strand became more expensive. And then we had the cuts in the funding for the AT services, so it comes out of the assistive technology budget at this time. So we were looking for ways to be able to continue to provide that program to teachers and still maintain our budget. So the Foundation was very gracious in helping us to be able to fund it in 2018.
Okay, so there was a program that existed and was growing in terms of the awareness that teachers had of the program and how many teachers were using it and how many students, I assume, were then benefiting from the program. And then it's cut from the budget. And we've talked before on this program about how the budget cuts have really impacted learning in the West Hartford Public Schools, and so the foundation was able to come in and fill that gap, right? Which makes me feel very good about what the foundation is doing. But can you tell me a little bit more about the experiences of the students who are using the materials from the program and how this can impact their learning paths?
Absolutely. Actually, I work with a group of students at one of the elementary schools, and I was able to sit in and watch them as they interacted with the program with their teachers and paraprofessionals, and to be able to see them be able to access the materials and to engage in the lesson plans and to do the activities at their level and to be successful was very rewarding to see that. And I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from teachers all across the district, from elementary all the way up till transition, who are currently using the program, saying it's been a game changer for a lot of students because they're able to actually participate in curriculum that they wouldn't have necessarily been able to do in the past.
No, I can't imagine how much angst the program reduces in the student population, especially neurodiverse students. The one-size-fits-all curriculum really does not work for the students who are benefiting from this program, I imagine. And so the individual tailoring aspects of it have to be a real breakthrough in the minds of the students who are actually benefiting from the program. Do you get to see any of that?
There are students that I go in to see as part of my AT consultation, and they will be working with their teacher on certain lessons, and so I'll sit in and I'll watch and I'll kind of observe them using the program and reading the passages and being successful in being able to read, and then afterwards the teacher will ask the questions and go through some of the activities, and I was able to watch them, and it's really great to see them being successful and being able to you can see how they understand. It's the comprehension piece, that they're able to understand the materials at that level, where it might be a more abstract topic like government, or something that's a little more complicated, like even students who are preparing for going out in the workforce and need to do personal care, who are just basically preparing themselves for the future, and this really benefits them, and it really is great that we have access to this.
And so there's also a bit of a current events function to this as well, is that right?
Yes, there is a separate unit called News to You, which is made by the Unique Learning System as well, and we have subscriptions that are we have currently available to some teachers in the district who, especially at the high school level, who want to make sure that students are aware of what's going on in their world. And so it's basically a picture-based newsletter, and talks about things like the Olympics are coming up, and ask questions about what are the Olympics and why do we have them and what happens at the Olympics. So it really helps students to be able to understand things that are currently going on in their world.
I love everything about that. So where do you see this type of learning, this program going in the future?
Well, I'm hoping that maybe in the future all students who have need of this program will be able to have access through it through exposure. Again, their teachers are aware that we have it, and so I've been going out and saying, this is something that we have available, please let me know and we'll give you access. And maybe at some point with more funding, maybe more teachers could have access to the full program, because right now what we're doing is we're downloading the strands and putting them up on Schoology, and that way teachers can download all of the activities and all of the unit lesson plans each month, because they come out each month, and so I download them onto the Schoology and I notify the teachers that they're ready, come and get them, and they can download them and use them with their students. Unfortunately, only the high school level teachers in the special needs resource rooms currently have access to the full version online, because licensing prevents sharing of that. So, but we are able to post those unique learning units so they can have access to them. So I'd like to see maybe more teachers having access to the full strand.
Well, I would certainly be in favor of that, and I actually do remember reading the grant proposal for this idea, and the grants that the foundation funds, they cover a wide range of topics, and they cover a large number of students. And it's wonderful when we have a grant where we bring in artists in residence to come and speak to a whole school of students, and you're impacting hundreds of students and they're having a wonderful moment. But this kind of programming, not only does it benefit students who are oftentimes marginalized in discussions about curriculum and the future of education, but it also impacts them at a very, very deep level. And so it might not be the sort of breadth in terms of number of students that some grants affect, but I cannot imagine how beneficial this program is to the students, to their educators, to the families of the students involved in these programs. I mean, I'm so thankful for the work that you're doing, and I'm so thankful that the foundation could play a part in that. Is there anything that you would like to say to the foundation, to our donors, anything that we haven't talked about?
Well, I just want to say that over the years, I've been with West Hartford for 8 years, and over the years, the foundation has been so generous to the students who are receiving those AT consults and those students who have special needs. They have been very gracious in providing grant funds for other programs that I manage as the AT specialist in the district, and I just want to say that it's very appreciated. I've seen the benefits around the district as I go to all 16 schools, so I see all of the difference that the foundation has made in providing the funding for the grants. And not just the grants that I have proposed, but also other grants that I've seen my colleagues have been able to procure and to be able to provide for the students in West Hartford. So I just want to say that the foundation is doing a phenomenal job, and I want to say that it very much appreciate it.
Well, thank you for your kind words. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
And now I'd like to welcome on Sally Nyan, history teacher at King Phillip Middle School. Sally, can you tell me a little bit about your grant?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Well, we're really excited to talk about this grant. We received the Frank Webb Home Grant. It is for community partnerships between West Hartford organizations and the students in West Hartford. So this particular grant, we're working with the Noah Webster House. We're also working with Tracy Wilson, who's the town historian. And she and Liz Devine and Denise DeMello, all three of whom were teachers here in West Hartford, they are the project coordinators for what we call the Witness Stones Project.
And can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. The Witness Stones Project is based on really bringing out the history of enslavement here in West Hartford. And recognizing the contributions of people who were enslaved in West Hartford, and just really, forcing us to kind of deal with our true history, which has been hidden for a long time.
So I think in the imaginations of most people, slavery was by and large confined to the South, plantation system, whether you have an ahistorical view of things like Gone with the Wind or Birth of a Nation, or if you have a more accurate view of things, I think people still tend to think of slavery as an institution unique to the American South. Obviously that's not the case. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of slavery in Connecticut, timelines, numbers, anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Connecticut. I was never taught about slavery in Connecticut. So what we do with the kids is we start off in the fall with a basic overview of slavery in the North. So what they come to realize, which is a shock for most kids, is that slavery was alive and well. In fact, Connecticut doesn't officially abolish slavery until 1848, which is just before the Civil War breaks out.
I'm astonished.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's got a long history. In fact, slavery is very responsible for creating Connecticut's wealth in the early years. So 1776, there are about 5,100 enslaved people in Connecticut. They are spread all over the state, and it's just a history that we're really not familiar with. So really it's a matter of introducing the kids to how present slavery was, how common it would be for you to see enslaved people, including here in West Hartford, and talking about the types of jobs that they did, and really bringing up some of the differences, because as you said, traditionally people think of slavery in the U.S. and you think of enslaved people working on cotton fields and the plantations in the South, right? There were actually plantations in Connecticut. They know of at least 2. The remains of one plantation, they found at least 60 unique names. They're not quite sure if that's 60 people or it could be 60 families, which means there could have been hundreds of people on that particular plantation. But most people in Connecticut, if they enslaved people, they had 2, 3, 4 people. Another big difference is enslaved people in the North generally lived in the same house as their enslavers, usually up in the attic. So in part because the numbers were so small, you did not need to have separate housing for people who were enslaved. But really, they worked in whatever the enslavers did. So if it was a farmer, they worked out in the fields. If the person was a merchant, they might have worked in the shop. Enslaved people often had skills. They could learn blacksmithing skills, rope making skills. And the other thing to realize is Connecticut is very, very heavily involved in the slave trade, particularly with the West Indies. Connecticut is becoming rich through the triangle trade, which is sending rum, exchanging it in Africa for people who were kidnapped and brought to the Caribbean, enslaved in the Caribbean. They're producing sugarcane and molasses and shipping it back up to Connecticut. Connecticut's turning it into rum. So that's the traditional triangle trade. What a lot of people don't realize is that Connecticut is very, very heavily involved in feeding enslaved people in the West Indies. So they are shipping literally thousands of tons of food a year to the West Indies. Because in the West Indies, it was actually more profitable to plant the sugarcane instead of planting food to feed the enslaved people. So Connecticut and other New England states or colonies are very heavily invested in that. Newport, Rhode Island is a tremendous center of the slave trade. Middletown is very heavily involved in the slave trade. And there's a lot of, people who we think of as, our founders who made their wealth, really, connected one way or another with slavery. And so really it's a matter of introducing the kids to that idea. So we do that in the fall. In the spring, we really focus on how slavery is present in what becomes West Hartford. Right? Our kids at King Phillip last year, we studied the Whiting family, and they enslaved a number of people. So there were 3 people in particular we looked at who were enslaved by the Whiting family. My team studied a man named Pompey. And then when we're done with studying these people, the kids work up a project. Every single 8th grader in the town of West Hartford last year participated in the project. Every single 8th grader in West Hartford will participate in this year. And at the end, we have a ceremony in the spring where we create a stone with the enslaved person's name and whatever information we can, find out about them. And we have inserted those stones in the old cemetery on North Main Street as a way of remembering how enslaved people contributed to our economy.
I think it's interesting that you're using the term enslaved people as opposed to slaves, and I would assume that that's because the people who were enslaved were still people and not objects,
exactly.
Which is what slave as a term would tend to indicate.
Exactly.
And so that sort of brings up a larger question. Having grown up in West Hartford myself and never learning anything about slavery in West Hartford, how did you find this information? I imagine it was not something that enslaved people, or not enslaved people, enslavers trumpeted, made very public.
True.
Certainly not in any sort of accounts of their life and the great things that they may have done.
Absolutely.
So how did you find this information? How did you find out about the enslaved people? I would imagine that records of them especially would have been very damning to these people who thought of themselves as community builders, who were building communities off of the backs of the people they were enslaving.
Absolutely. I want to give a little credit to a man named Dennis Culleton. He just retired last year. He was a teacher in Guilford. And he really started this program that we kind of took on and have called Witness Stones. His inspiration was really a program in Germany called, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but it's something like the Stolperstein, okay. And literally in German, I guess that means stumbling stones. And it's a program that's still going on in Germany. And what they did was to take people who were victims of the Nazis and who were sent off to the camps, and they put a stone in front of that person's last known place of residence. And so as you walk throughout Germany, and it's expanded to other countries throughout Europe as well, you literally stumble over these stones, and it forces you to think about what happened. So Dennis began a program. He took that idea and he put into it, how do we recognize Guilford's history of enslavement? Through a kind of complicated series of events, we became aware of this, and a couple of different people have contacted Dr. Chad Ellis, he's our department supervisor, with ideas about this, and then Dr. Wilson got involved, and Liz and Denise have gotten involved, and they're actually the ones doing the research for us. So they're going to the Connecticut Historical Society, they're looking through the records, they're combing through the records, because that's really hard for 8th graders to access. I mean, you're looking at wills, you're looking at property deeds, you're looking at inventories.
Things that would require the eye of a trained historian as opposed to an amateur 14-year-old.
Exactly, they're pretty specialized documents. Now, Liz and Tracy and Denise, they're working with the documents. They're finding the records, and this information is often hidden. For the most part, people aren't saying, "Oh, here is my enslaved person." They're using code words, and we work with that with the kids to get them to recognize the code words. So you do see people referred to as, Negro boy or Negro girl. Many of the enslaved people are unnamed. Those who are named have one name. And then you'll also see keywords like his servant or my man. And so those are just keywords that help. We help the kids recognize that, these are people who were enslaved. So we work specifically with John Whiting, who was pretty much a founding member of what becomes West Hartford.
I think Whiting Lane
exactly,
comes from the Whiting
exactly.
family.
His house is still on North Main Street. So there were enslaved people kept in that house,
wow.
Which is something the kids really relate to. And then the documents are brought in. Liz and Tracy and Denise help us work with the kids with the documents. We talk about what kind of documents they are. We'll go through inventory lists and wills, and we'll work with them to understand what all that, and decode really what that language is all about. But you're right. I mean, the people who were enslaved don't get their moment in the sun.
I would think not until now.
Yes.
Right? That's what the ultimate goal of the project is.
Yeah, and that's what to me is just amazing, because when we study history, for a lot of reasons we focus on the movers and the shakers and the doers, and that's perfectly understandable. But those people are dependent on the average everyday person. And we don't, usually we focus on political history and not social history. This project is really designed to focus on social history and the legacies of social history, really. So we're really uncovering the contributions made by people who allowed other people to go out and work their business and gain wealth.
I have to imagine, putting myself in the shoes of an 8th grader in town, driving down North Main Street once a week, once a month, something of that nature, and you're seeing John Whiting's house off the side of the road, and what I would assume is happening in the minds of those 8th graders is just a little reminder, someone who lived there, the person for which that house is now famous, owned other human beings, kept them as property, passed them on to their descendants as property, did not think it of any value to give these people, allow these people to have names, to allow them to have proper burial sites. And that seems to me to be a really important part of what history can function as in the body politic, in our collective imaginations, not as a fairy tale of what we'd like to tell ourselves of what our history is, but actually what really happened in the real places that make up the communities in which we all live and play active roles. So I'm curious the reactions that students had to this project. How many of them were familiar with slavery in Connecticut, in West Hartford at all? And how do they feel when they're learning about some of these people whose names are familiar and the other people who, as you say, made it so that they could be famous, and have gone totally unrecognized on the historical record?
Well, I think for 8th grade, you know, 8th graders are very, very in tune with anything about injustice. And so the 8th graders were really fascinated by this project. A woman named Ann Farrow, who was part of a trio of authors who created a book about Connecticut's role in the slave trade, which is a great book. It's called Complicity. She said in another book that she wrote about the slave trade that slavery is the landscape you learn to see. And I think that's a really great quote, because this is what our 8th graders have learned to do. You know, they've learned that so many of the things they look at through town are connected with slavery in some way or another. I know my students were absolutely fascinated by the fact that the Whiting House still stands. And in project after project, you know, kids mention, you know, I walk by this house, I go by this house every single day. And now I know that, you know, people who had no power were treated and abused here. And it brings the history home to them in a way that is much more personalized, and it makes them feel history.
And can I ask what these stones are that you have here, as we're sort of running low on time here? This this seems like the ultimate point of the project, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a prototype of the stone. What happens is that these will eventually have a copper coating on them, and then this information is engraved in it. And the final stones are now, the first set of stones is now in the cemetery.
Really?
Yeah. Okay. So my kids last year, they studied a man named Pompey. There was very, very little known about Pompey, other than the fact that he was given to Colonel John Whiting from his father. So he was passed to Colonel John Whiting. Colonel John Whiting, when he died, he left Pompey as property to his wife Jerusha. When Jerusha died, she willed Pompey to her sons. So, and that again is something that the kids, they're horrified and fascinated at the same time. You know, how is it possible to treat people like this? How is it possible that, you know, you did not recognize the humanity of people? So that's really what we're doing with this, is we're making a physical remembrance to hopefully really just stop people in their tracks a little bit and think, you know, this happened here. It's not something that we can just say happened down south. You know, we can't say, oh, we were the good guys, we fought to get rid of slavery and that, you know, abolishes all our sins, because it doesn't. We were very heavily invested in slavery. And this is really just a way of recognizing that, coming to terms with what we've done in our history, because really if we want to move forward, we have to reconcile with the past. And for the kids, it's a visual reminder. I mean, I honestly think our kids that are involved in this, you know, if they stay in town, when they have kids of their own, they will be very proud to go down to the cemetery and be like, you know, I was part of the first group who helped tell this history of West Hartford.
Yeah, I would hope, and helped restore some dignity to people whose dignity was largely robbed from them.
Yeah.
I can't imagine being a student who would experience this project firsthand. I mean, the way it would change how you view your community. And as you say, Connecticut was not just part of the Union that fought against the Confederacy. And two things can be true. And I think this is an important reminder that history is very complicated. And there could be Connecticut soldiers who died at the Battle of Gettysburg, and there can also be people who lived in Connecticut, in West Hartford, who owned slaves. You know, if there's one thing that we haven't talked about that you could say to our audience, to the foundation, what would that be?
Well, I think really, you know, we're trying to keep this project going as long as possible. We're finding, the more research we do with it, we're finding more and more people who were enslaved. I think it's a very positive project for the town. it's not something that you need to feel bad about. I mean, we're not trying to say, oh, look at West Hartford, they did a terrible thing.
Well, sure, none of the students owned slaves.
Absolutely, right? And
enslaved people.
It's okay, I do the same thing. And that's one of the points I make with the kids as well. You weren't responsible for this. But if you want to understand where our country is now, you have to understand where we're coming from, and you have to be open to the entire history, not just one specific strand of history that's been passed on for years and years and years. You know, you really have to look at the experiences of a wide variety of people. And that's really what we're trying to do here, is just diversify our outlook and get more than just one story out there. So we hope that people will support the project. When we have the program in the spring, we'll encourage parents to come see the program. We'll encourage people to go down to the cemetery and look at the stones, and really just to think about, you know, what they mean.
I will be there.
That'd
I
be
think
great.
this is an important part of the community coming to terms with who we are, who we've been, and who we can be moving forward. You know, I think it's good that you're reminding the students that they're not responsible for the evils of slavery in Connecticut, but what they are and what we are all responsible for is maintaining the truth of what happened.
And learning about the past. I mean, we all have a responsibility to understand our future, and that can only, in our present, and that can only be done by understanding the past.
Well, Sally, I really appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Well, folks, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're interested in learning more about the foundation or these grants, please visit fwhps.org.